Welcome to A Reason for Hope. My name is Adrian, and I'm in studio with our pastor, Sean Richards, one of our pastors, assistant pastor, or all-around cool pastor. Is that
whatever doesn't get me thrown out of the building.
Nice. Well, we're happy to be here. Welcome to Apologetics Monday. That's right. We are bringing back every Monday. We will deal with an apologetics-oriented session where we will talk about how, and of course, apologetics means to offer up a defense or a response to those who are sort of not necessarily attacking, but trying to diffuse, is that right?
Dismiss.
Debunk the historic Christian faith. And today we're going to be discussing New Testament archaeology, or the evidences for New Testament historicity. And so we are excited to be sharing that with you all today. For those of you tuning in for the first time, this is A Reason for Hope. This is a weekday Bible answer program where we take questions from our live stream audience about the Christian faith, about how to interpret the Bible, how to apply the Bible to your life. Or maybe you're a skeptic and you want to know, why do you believe what you believe? Why should anyone believe anything at all, let alone the Christian faith? So if you have questions like that, please tune in. We'd love to have you. There are multiple ways you can engage with us. We are live streaming simultaneously to multiple social media platforms. And so if you want to ask a question, you can join us on, for example, YouTube. Go to youtube.com/@A-Reason4Hope, or just go to YouTube and search for our channel, which is called A Reason for Hope. And if you see the little red icon with the white dove, then you know you have found us. Use the comment box to ask your questions. We're monitoring those throughout the entire time. The reason we make such a big deal about how to ask questions is that historically, this was a call-in program. So people would just call in on the radio. It was like that for a couple decades. And over the last several years, we've switched from a call-in program to a live stream. And of course, with the live stream, it's easier to just take comments from the comment section. So that's what we do. You can catch us also on Facebook, facebook.com/CCF Tucson. That is our church Facebook page. We live stream all of our services to these platforms. So if you want to check out our Wednesday evening Oasis service at 6:30 p.m., you can do so, as well as our Sunday morning 9 and 11 a.m. services, which we are currently going through the book of Acts, which is very relevant to today's subject because we're going to talk about the author of the book of Acts as a historian, not just an author, but a historian. So that'll be really interesting. So if you want to join us on Facebook, again, just join the live stream, like, subscribe, follow, give us a thumbs up if you don't mind, but make a comment, even if it's hello. I really appreciate the engagement. And if you have a question, just use the comment section to ask your questions. We're now live streaming to the X platform, formerly Twitter. So if you want to follow our senior pastor, Scott Richards, you can do so. Just go to twitter.com or x.com, and that'll take you to the same place. And you can follow his Twitter handle, which is ScottR4H. That's ScottR4H. And if you are a follower, when we go live on the right pane of the homepage on x.com, you can see that he will go live, and then you can join the chat there as well. You can also DM a question if you wanted to, or just tweet out a question. You can do that as well and be just fine. If you want to sort of send a message a little more discreetly, maybe a little more private, you can also email us. Our email address is questions@areasonforhope.org. That's questions@areason4hope.org. And last but not least, if you want to watch the live stream and don't want to engage on a social media platform, you can just go to our website. That's calvarychristianfellowship.com. And you can hit that Watch Live tab, and that'll take you to not only a screen that you can watch the live stream, you can even just log in with a fake name if you want to, whatever you want to do, and you can ask questions in the little comment box there as well. Excited about today's topic. And Sean, if you want to take a moment, we can pray and get started.
That sounds good. Hi, Dad, thank you for restoring my health and giving me the honor and opportunity to be here with Adrian, as well as your spirit, to communicate your word and show why it is a stable ground that we can stand on, as your son not only demonstrated to us, but shared with us personally. As your people are going to be listening this next hour, I pray that the points that we make will be clear and understandable, as well as succinct and based entirely on your word and your character. We're thankful for the mercy that we have in you and ask that we would also know wisdom and truth in that same source as well. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
That is true.
Should we do a little intro?
Yeah, obviously this is following up a bit on what you've already discussed. And when we're discussing historical evidence, obviously people can play fast and loose with words and say, well, that doesn't count as evidence. So before we get into that, we want to start with our criteria. This criteria wasn't something that was come up with by some Bible-thumping fanatic. It was actually founded by the modern founder of not just biblical, but archaeology carte blanche, Napoleon Bonaparte, when he started not only reuniting, but intending to reestablishing an imperial Europe. He started coming across discoveries and wanted to rekindle history that started to be inspired in gathering areas other than, of course, Europe itself. The British Museum is not only the place that borrowed everything from everyone else and fortunately preserved it so that we knew something more about history, that it didn't end up becoming someone else's wall. But when he laid out these criterion, he laid forward the same principles that we would apply to any other culture, any other religion, any other society. So when we're looking for evidence, when we're looking for archaeology, we're not saying, look at this piece of mortar or this piece of pottery or that scratching inside of a rock. This proves 100% beyond any rational doubt that the Bible is true. Obviously, someone could just come along and manufacture evidence. There's always room for doubt. The problem, though, is when you need more evidence, you need more faith in order to prove your point than what's actually warranted. And if you are constantly moving the goalpost, as it's oftentimes stated, if you are putting yourself in a position where you are talking to people who are always coming up with other explanations, who have an impossible criteria to meet when it comes to things they don't like, but then a completely gullible criteria when it comes to anything that they want to believe in. You know, I saw a Reddit post on it. That's good enough for me. Meanwhile, we show this mountain of evidence that every single respected scholar on the planet has to admit is true, and they'll say that's no evidence at all. They don't know what they're talking about. So when we're going through evidence for the Bible, and as you're going to be listening along as well, what we want you to take away from this, more than just the data, is the equation we're plugging it all into and why it can be trusted. So starting first and foremost with the concept of archaeology, as well as written information, which we'll get into with the manuscripts in a recap. We're looking for people, places, and things. That's the simplest way that we could put it. When it comes to something being more likely to be true, the definition of evidence, not conclusive, but more likely to be true, we look for mentioning of real people, mentioning of real places, and mentioning of actual things that fit the time period. False narratives, of course, would mention people at the wrong time or in the wrong places. You know, you have accounts of Alexander the Great going to places that never existed, like the place where the sun sets, according to the Quran. Or you get into accounts and mythologies of him traveling to Japan. No one claims this, obviously, but he never reached that far. He stopped at the borders of India. And that's the evidence that we actually have for him and the technology he would have had to travel that far in his short life. These are the sort of things historians look for, and an error in that would be saying the people and the places and the things around them don't match. Regarding the places, if they mention fictional places like the kingdom or the empire of the Ouroboros or the city of Atlantis, for example, we have no reason to believe this is an actual account, or at least that information in the account is authentic, because we have no other reason to believe it. Orichalcos, excuse me. That was what I was thinking of. Ouroboros is the symbol of the snake eating itself. Another example of the sort of things that we're looking for, an error in that would be stuff like anachronisms. You've probably seen the comedic meme shared of a Tyrannosaurus holding an M16 as he storms the beaches of D-Day, whereas a trained historian would look at that photograph and realize that the M16 was not in fact in circulation at the time of the storming of Normandy on June 6th, 1944. So obviously if the T-Rex was storming the beaches of Normandy, he would have had a BAR or something equivalent. I'm, of course, joking. T-Rexes weren't around then either. But the point being made is this. When we are looking at the Bible and it claims to be a historical narrative, and we'll get into where and when in a moment, we ultimately need to hold it to the same criteria we would for anything else. And when you run into people who say, well, the Bible makes extraordinary claims, thus it requires extraordinary proof. Extraordinary can be warranted. We call them miracles, but it shouldn't be unreasonable. If I can't come to any conclusion, if I apply your standard to anything else that I arbitrarily deem extraordinary, then I can't form any conclusion from it. And a math question that doesn't solve any problems isn't math. It's just a roadblock at the end of the day. So when talking to people, understand and remind them that this is what we're looking for. Real people, real places, and real things. More reasons to believe that something else is more likely to be true. And if the number of reasons to trust it outweighs the number of reasons or possibilities to doubt it, and note, things to trust as opposed to ideas to doubt, we want tangible things, empiricists, right? People who only believe in what you can see, touch, and taste. It's all centered around what's actually there. And if I have more reason to believe these things, we'll have a separate example for the Old Testament, but especially for the New, because that's the same narrative that tells us about the resurrection. I want to know that that can be trusted. I want to know that that's reliable. And so we're going to go through some people, places, and things that include the first two.
Yeah, it's a good breakdown, and to set the stage, because we have to know, why is this irrelevant? Why is this important? And as I went through a couple weeks ago, I went through the same question, the historicity of the New Testament writers, specifically the Gospels, but we focus mostly on manuscript evidence. Today we're going to focus on the archaeological evidence. But just to summarize what I covered just a couple weeks ago, I'll take you through. By the way, most of the content that we'll discuss here, a lot of it is in the book Unmasking the Masquerade, which I helped co-author, and the section that I wrote was entitled Jesus, Myth, Magician, or Messiah. And why is this relevant to us? Well, Jesus made it very clear. I am the light of the world, he said. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Jesus made a very extraordinary claim about himself. He claimed to be the absolute light of the world, the savior of all humanity. So this is a very, very important question. And whenever I am sharing with a group of students, I always ask the same question that Jesus asked. He said, who do you say that I am? Well, we have a couple of options. Obviously, Jesus was either just an ordinary human person or who he claimed to be, God come from heaven. Those are our only two options. Obviously, you could come up with some kind of crazy alternative other than that, but really those are our options. Either he was telling the truth or he's just an ordinary human person. Now, if he is just an ordinary human person, one of our options then are that people lied about him, meaning that Jesus made no radical claims, but the people lied about who he was, and therefore much of what we believe about Jesus today is considered myth. In other words, there is a true historical Jesus, but that is not the Jesus of faith. Much like our sayings about Santa Claus, you could say that Santa Claus was a real person in history,
He was.
and that over time, things about him, we maintain sort of the symbolism and the meaning of who he was, what he stood for, and so on. But the little added padding to who he really was, it became a myth. And so with Jesus, it was a real revolutionary human being who lived in the first century. There's no question that he existed. There was no question that he was actually executed on a Roman cross. Those are literally indisputable. But everything else we believe, Jesus' miracles and claiming to be God, all those things were sort of made up later, right, Sean? That many of the Christian authors started believing that Jesus was divine. I'm sorry, not Christian authors, later Christian believers started believing that Jesus was divine. And so we have to rely on handwritten copies of these eyewitness accounts. And the claim is that over time, these eyewitness accounts were doctored, that maybe there was an original account of Jesus' life, but we have no idea what it could say. Maybe we know maybe 20% based on the Gospels, but the rest was sort of fabricated or altered or...
Notice no evidence but a theory.
It is just a theory.
You can't actually establish that.
And that is because scribes would have to do these things by hand. They would write these manuscripts down, and what we're concerned about is up until the date of the printing press. And I mentioned that from the printing press, we now can make copies of the Bible without error. But before that, copies were made by hand. And so we rely on manuscripts to tell us, what the original gospel writers wrote. And these manuscripts, for example, this is P52, one of the oldest manuscripts that we have. It's written on both sides. So that's not two pieces. That's one piece, but showing you both sides of that piece, is dated to about AD 125. Now, we have tens of thousands of these manuscripts. And as I explained a couple weeks ago, the significance of this between the time of the original writers, I mentioned also the quotations by the early church fathers, as well as other manuscripts. We can date back to the first century, or the turn of the first to the second century, manuscripts dating to every single century, all the way up until the printing press. So the question becomes, okay, if the New Testaments have the writings were not preserved and they were changed, show me where the change happened. Because we can find a manuscript dating to that time frame where we can compare to the rest and see how much significant change has there been. And what we concluded a couple weeks ago is that the evidence screams that the New Testament has been preserved. Not only that, but we set up these three criteria, and see if you can add anything to this, Sean. We wanted to know, can I trust the stories of Jesus' life in the Bible? And we can if they are from people who were there, eyewitnesses. Check. Passed on accurately, which we covered that. And again, if you want to go back to that episode from 2 weeks ago, Monday, you can check that out if you like. It's up on our website. But if it's passed on accurately, and so we did a check. Now, is it telling the truth? And this is the role that archaeology plays. Archaeology helps us affirm that the stories were not made up. So that means that, sure, I could have exactly what they wrote, but what if they wrote a bunch of nonsense? That's where archaeology comes into play.
Yeah, if the copies are of a lie, then that is an inaccurate conclusion to make that was reliably transmitted. But if, on the other hand, you're in a place where you, of course, are making poor copies of the truth, that also leads to distortion because it's other than what you wanted at the beginning or at the end. If we can demonstrate that this was reliably copied through the copies, then what was copied? What is the material?
What is the original
what was being
source
said?
material? Yeah. And archaeology helps us determine whether the author was concerned about being historically accurate or not. If a person names people, places, and things with such accuracy, with a care and attention to details, then we can assume safely, not just assume, but it points to that this person is trying to tell a true story of what they saw, heard, interviewed. Of course, Luke is not an eyewitness, but he wrote his gospel based on eyewitness accounts. And of course, Acts, he was a witness to much of it because he was a traveling companion of Paul.
Which is not your theory. That's how the Gospel of Luke starts.
Yeah. And so let's take a look for a moment really quick of just how much Luke puts his credibility on the table when he writes in chapter 3, beginning, he says, "Now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip was tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis," a couple of things I picked up on my last trip through Asia.
Oh boy.
"In the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas." Now you can tell that already he has put himself at risk of being proven a fraud by naming people's places and times. If he is an author who made up these stories at a later date, he wouldn't have firsthand information about these things. If he was someone who didn't care about details, he also wouldn't have had any reason to mention with such accuracy these places. So he mentions Tiberius Caesar, he mentions Pontius Pilate, he mentions Caiaphas. So the question for us is there any archaeological evidence to prove that Luke was writing accurate history?
Yeah, and it ultimately stems from not the Bible says it, therefore it's true. The Bible made statements. Are they true? That is different. So when you're put in the position of the fundamentalist fanatic understand that there are better ways to phrase the exact same thing. We're not compromising inerrancy. We're being effective communicators as to the reason for the hope that is within us. So, and again, there are two ways to go about this. You can either assume skepticism and convert yourself in the conversation and say, look, I played by your rules and you still lost. Or you can note your assumptions but justify them every step of the way. Now, if I'm going to take the skeptics route and say, okay, are real people, real places, real things mentioned here? We have the names of several people. Tiberius Caesar, was he a real person? Pontius Pilate, was he a real person? Caiaphas, a high priest, was he a real person? What reasons do we have to believe those three statements? And the answers are obviously, well, let's start digging and find out if we have him mentioned, if you can date the not only objects but the time frame of which they were being used, and they match the general time frame of the gospel accounts, because of course the dating methods are never going to be 100% accurate, then you can say, I have more reason than less to believe these individuals were actual people. So when I am told about other people that I may not have as much evidence for, like Philip or Ananias, then I go off of what I do know, not what I can't know, or at least what I can't verify yet. Because you go to Israel today, you see there's these huge mounds and stuff, and that's not for like strategic defense against the missiles or anything. Those are literally just piles of civilizations they just haven't gotten around to digging yet. So a lot is left to be uncovered. But the point being made is this: what evidence, what actual tangible things do we have that would give us more reason to believe people like Caesar Tiberius existed? Well, we can go to Roman records. He uses a Roman title. We can go through other individuals who wrote about the Roman Empire and ask them, would this be around that same time frame that we'd expect? Would he be around the BC AD transitional period and so forth? Would Caesar Augustus, of course, also fit into this? Would we go to Pontius Pilate? Do we have any mentionings of him? Not just at all. A lot of people can be named Pontius Pilate, I suppose, but in the specific Judea region that he's attributed to, and with the kind of job title that he's given, these are the sort of things that we're asking. Now, of course, I'm kind of stacking the deck in my favor because we haven't answered all three of those questions, don't we?
Yeah, in fact, there was a discovery in the port city of Caesarea, and Sean and I have both been there. In fact, this port city I took a picture of when I was there in 2014, and they found a dedicated, like a cornerstone, and that's I think a replica of it. I think the original might be in the British Museum.
It's under lock and key somewhere.
Yeah,
this
it's
is
somewhere.
A big thing.
I don't think that I would be able to get that close to it if it was a genuine one, but this was at an Israeli museum. And here's the inscription. I covered this a little bit, but I was kind of rushing through it. So these are the words in the original language, which say, to the people of Caesarea Tiberium, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has given or dedicated to. And of course, the latter part's a little difficult to read because of erosion and so on. But a scholar said, well, more idiomatically, this is what it's actually saying. Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has given or dedicated to the people of Caesarea a public building or temple in honor of Tiberius.
And what's important about that plate, for those of you listening on radio, is that the first line literally says Tiberium. And the second line mentions Pontius Pilate, and it goes on to note these specific names. Now, the people who come to these conclusions, religiously biased or not, we have something that mentions at the right place, the right people, at the right time, as Luke would present them. So what do we have? We have 1, 2, 3 more reasons to believe Luke was getting his facts straight, at least as far as this chapter goes. In his introduction of the time of Jesus' birth, he sets the frame with historical landmarks, people who lived at this time, this place, doing these things. Tiberius was emperor, Pilate was governor, these other people were doing their shenanigans. But it's all centered around more reasons to trust rather than less. And of course, Luke chapter 3 covers more than just Jesus' birth. That was more in the previous chapter. But it's all centered around how the old historians did their jobs. They didn't have a dating calendar as we would know it today. They did have a point of emphasis based on certain cultures, but the things that they looked for, and this is true of the Old Testament as well, it's all centered around what question? Are these things we can not know, but verify? That's always the question that needs to be asked.
And what's interesting is, as Sean points out, that this corresponds to what Luke says, and that's what we're looking for. Is if the Gospel of Luke is historically accurate, because he mentions in Luke in the Acts of the Apostles, 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands without a single mistake. Here's what a New Testament scholar, F.F. Bruce, said about Luke's historicity. He says, sure, familiarity with the proper titles of all notable persons who are mentioned in his pages is one of the most remarkable tokens of his accuracy. And so, and there's several other little quotations from him and many other New Testament scholars and Roman historians who basically take Luke, his gospel, and the book of Acts at face value as historically true.
And note, F.F. Bruce may be among those Christian fanatics, but he's not alone in this. The point of emphasis is, if you don't like the person, then at least listen to the words. What's the data? He mentions places, and he gets it right. He mentions people, and it not only fits the when, but the who of who would have been alive at that time. And these are the things that we need to ask in order to be given, not conclusive reasons, I'll keep repeating it because it's important, but more reasons to have remember this word, reasonable faith. More reasons to trust than less, and better reasons to trust than most.
Well, I compiled a list of a few discoveries that affirm some of the mentioning, especially the ones that were somewhat skeptical. Is there any ones that you want to cover today?
Well, the one that I always try to keep in the back of my mind is Sir William Ramsay. He was the leading expert on the Roman Empire and started his examination of the book of Acts and Luke as a skeptic. And as a result of his examination, he concluded, not just on an intellectual but a personal basis, that this is communicating the truth about God. Now, if someone starts from a position of hostility and is won over, then there's one of two things that are happening. Either emotional circumstances led him to it, maybe three. Either a purely intellectual pursuit, given his expertise, led him to that conclusion, or both. I'll include that note in the third. But given the fact that Sir William Ramsay was an individual who was considered the premier Roman historian of his time, for him to come to this conclusion, you have to factor the facts of the table into it at least somewhat.
Because he actually set out to disprove the New Testament. He was biased against, but approached it from a historical vantage point, digging up with a shovel, finding things, and as he continued to pursue more and more evidence from the ground, from physical digging,
as well as what he already knew as a historian.
And he became not necessarily a believer. I don't know
right away
what his spiritual life was like, but he affirmed the New Testament was historically accurate and that it was espousing truth.
Yeah, and there's other individuals, Simon Greenleaf, for example. He was a leading lawyer and evidence-based attorney in examining these sort of issues, made his case based on the gospel accounts and said that this would be perfectly admissible in court. It meets all the criteria. Now, real quick is just a slight pause so that you don't think we're just huddling in a corner here and not getting into the other areas of the Bible, specifically the New Testament, like Revelation or Romans. The reason why we're focusing on Luke and Acts is because they're of the historical genre. If we're asking history questions, then you want to read history books. And like the Old Testament, the New is categorized in 3 sections: history, poetry, and prophecy. History, what happened. Poetry, the personal letters that were written to the churches in light of the history, the personal human interactions and doctrines that were formed with it. And then prophecy, meaning the book of Revelation, things that are spoken from God's perspective. If we're speaking from a subjective experience, meaning John's vision, we'd have to go to the Old Testament to note the significance of those visions and why I trust him. Nothing in archaeology can verify whether or not someone had a genuine vision or not. When I look at Paul's instructions and practices, his doctrinal conclusions about the life of Jesus, that's all well and good, but it could be a fan fiction for all we care if it's not based on historical fact, which is why we want to start and end in the realm of archaeology with the right genre. Matthew through John and Acts are all centered around this concept of showing you this is what happened, this is why we believe this happened, and this is what then you're going to do with it in light of that.
We were there. We bear witness to these things. Here's a small example of one of the discoveries. There was an archway, and the stone that was discovered. Luke mentions polytarchs. He lists. I think I can't remember how many times Luke uses the word polytarchs, but for a while, scholars thought, oh, well, he's making this up. It's not real.
We hadn't seen it anywhere else, and note, that's reasonable because we had no other reason to believe those titles were used. They thought that it was just in general Asia Minor and Greece, they'd use the term for a proconsul or maybe just governor, those kinds of things, but they saw in this specific region, Luke records a title we hadn't seen before. Then we find this slab, and what does it say?
Yeah, and on the stone, it lists actually 6 polytarchs, rulers of the citizens, by that very name. So it was a very unique and very time-sensitive and region-sensitive terminology. And Luke gets it right. So he was authenticated. He was vindicated because for a long time, they thought, well, he's just making stuff up. There's no such thing as polytarchs. And, of course, that's what William Ramsey thought initially. And then he began to write his what he thought Luke's history was, the accuracy of it. And he wrote, Luke's history is unsurpassed in respect to its trustworthiness. Luke is a historian of the first rank. So that's very, very
complimentary.
Yeah, and it's very important because what the claim is that first, well, the word was not preserved, which we've debunked that claim. Well, it was written later. These weren't written by eyewitnesses. Well, that's the Gnostic Gospels. We've debunked that. These things are first century writings from first century eyewitnesses, and their familiarity with something that even modern day archaeologists did not know, they got right, such as polytarchs. And you can just go on throughout the book of Acts and get a shovel, and you will probably find more evidence.
Well, you don't even necessarily need a shovel. You could note the measurements that they took when he was about to be shipwrecked in the later chapters on his way to Rome and off of the island where they ultimately met their prophesied, by the way, safe return. We can talk about them getting customs and religious ceremonies right that they didn't have access to. That'll be more relevant when we talk about the Old Testament. But it's really key to understand that as you're saying all of this, the skeptic's mind is going to say, yeah, they talked about polytarchs, but why does that then prove that when he was in those cities, his sweatbands were healing people from sickness? Yeah, he mentions real people, but Spider-Man comics mention real people. Why should I believe yours and not those fairy tales? And of course, I'm being hostile here for the sake of the character. Mm-hmm. When you mention, okay, Pilate was a real person, why then does that suddenly make Jesus a real miracle worker? Do you see how the lines aren't connecting? And this is where we slap our foreheads, because we're not trying to prove every word of the Bible in order to trust a single word of the Bible. That's what we were talking about when we said no historical narrative would survive that critique, including your account of whether or not you ate breakfast this morning, because someone else could come along and sow doubt. But if on the other hand you'd say, okay, he got this fact right, something tangible, something that we can verify. I have one verified fact. And normally the things that have tangible evidence are worth more than a theory, intangible evidence. But remember what evidence means. I have more reason to trust this than less. And if I have greater evidence, quality evidence, when he got superficial details right, I wanted to emphasize those syllables, but I think I tripped over one there. Superficial details right, then what does that say about the explicit, the significant details? If they were honest here, then I have more reason to believe he was honest there. This is why we're taking the skeptic's route and still winning, because the point of emphasis isn't, I can prove everything to you, because you are the problem. The point of emphasis needs to be, I have more reason to trust this tangibly, physically, than you imaginatively. And this is why we're taking this from a historical perspective. Because when we are challenged on these things, it's a reasonable request. What reason do I have, that's why the word's in it, to believe this? Well, obviously, if I examine a body and, their leg was healed, I can't verify that that was, in fact, the same person that Jesus healed. I can't verify whether or not, if they were healed, that it was broken that beforehand. I can't interview, exercise necromancy or something and start interviewing all the corpses and say, did you know that guy? And hopefully not run out of my 6 questions. Let me know if you get that reference. But the point being made is this. Evidence means something that makes something else more likely to be true.
Mm-hmm.
And we're looking at superficial details to make objective conclusions about the significant, the explicit details.
And the reason why this isn't a Spider-Man comic, even though Spider-Man may mention real people, places, and times, is that the author of Spider-Man is not intending for us to believe in Spider-Man.
Yeah,
that's not their mission, nor are the authors or creators of a character like Spider-Man dying for such stories. Whereas the authors of the New Testament are claiming that these things really happened, that they saw them with their own eyes, touched the evidence with their own hands, and then gave their lives for the stories they're telling.
And don't take Adrian's word for it. Read 1 John chapter 1, 1 through 3. That's exactly what they said about their own testimonies.
Yeah, and so by pointing to archaeology, we're demonstrating that not only is the authorship contemporary to the life of Jesus and bearing the marks of eyewitness testimony, but it also demonstrates a attention to details and being accurate. When Luke starts his gospel, he says, look, I've compiled everything to give you an orderly account, because he wanted to be a truth teller. And when you look at Acts, his level of not only minute details of things, but he's accurate. He's accurate over and over and over again. And so you have to look at that as going, wow, these do not bear the marks of fairy tales or mythology or legends. When you go into the Gnostic writings, you see a very different picture, a very different all set of writing style, because they were written over 120 years after the fact, written under pseudonyms, and we know that they're not eyewitness testimony, especially when they mention crazy things like, in order for women to go to heaven, they must become male.
Or at the resurrection, that 2 angels with heads that reached as high as heaven were carrying Jesus out, and then a talking cross followed behind them and explained to the voice from heaven that I have set out the purpose which I had done, and then the cross got literally taken up, and then the 2 angels and all that other fun stuff. We know where those cultural references were from. We know the heads reaching up to heaven and beyond and so forth were the sort of things that would get spooky. But the idea was, okay, what reason do I have to trust that? Can I back that up anywhere? Obviously not. It's describing a subjective experience or a supernatural vision. Okay, well, what reason do I have to trust the author then? Well, he said he was Peter. 100 years after his death? Oh, so I have one less reason to believe he's going to tell me the truth, because his title page is a lie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Here's another little example of Luke's accuracy. He mentions Caiaphas. Well, there is an issue in 1992 of Biblical Archaeology Review. These are archaeologists and scholars who are not Christians, who are not believers. They're just doing archaeology based on the Bible, but not necessarily trying to prove anything otherwise. But in this issue of October 1992, they found a bone box. There was tractors building a highway in Israel, and the tractor fell to the ground, and lo and behold, there's a grave site. And of course, for about 100 years, from about 30 BC to about 70 AD, there was this practice of, after a year after your death, they would take your remains and put them in these stone ossuaries and put them on a family grave site, usually on a shelf. They'd be stacked up. And so these little bone boxes, well, they were stone, so I don't know, you can call them a box, but we find these, and they're really great testament to the life and times of individuals during that time frame. And this particular bone box dates to the 1st century, and they can do this by using the art and science of not paleography, when they study the handwriting styles, And not only that, but also the types of materials that are made of. And on here it says Joseph, son of Caiaphas. And so that affirms what the writer of Luke says. And of course, Matthew, there's a quotation there. And those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest.
He mentions a real name and a real person that we also reference elsewhere. And note, this is important, at the right time and in the right conditions, because he was also described as not only the high priest, but the sponsored high priest ahead of his father-in-law Ananias, who was, of course, the actual high priest, but Caiaphas was what? The one the Romans liked. So when we see his huge estate, and of course where his family tomb included this bone box of his son, we have a reference to his dad, who obviously passed on the home to his son, and fill in the narrative not with a intellectual theory, but with actual basis. We're not skipping across the lake, we're walking on solid stones.
Another quick example was the belief that, well, the writers of the Gospels were obviously writing things after the fact because the writers mentioned Jesus being nailed to a cross. Well, that couldn't have been, the 30 AD because they didn't use nails at that time. They may have used nails 100 years later or more, and that's why they mentioned nails, because they didn't know that crucifixions didn't use nails during that time. And boom, that's proof that these writers wrote long after the fact and are making this up. Well,
real quick, when someone throws out that little gem saying, well, they wrote those things after the fact, that's how time works. If you see something and you write it down even immediately, you wrote it down after the fact, but that's just an aside.
That's a good point. Long after the fact, 100 or more years later.
That's the illustration with the T-Rex and the M16.
Yeah, usually they'll say things like, when I say they, I mean historians will, at least my understanding is that it takes about 120 years for historical events to start to become legend, where legend starts to corrupt the story. And so anything written after 120 years of the life of Jesus could be corrupted with mythology, legend, hearsay, made up stories. And so nails fall into that category. So was the claim. There was a university professor that popularized the idea that the gospel writers obviously wrote way, way after the fact because they mentioned nails. Well, lo and behold, again, Biblical Archaeology Review does a whole issue that discovery in 1968 at that time, the very first crucifixion victim ever found. And here is a picture that I took at the same museum in Israel. This is a replica of it, but what had happened is that the nail had gone into the cross and had hit a knot and got bent. And rather than trying to unbend this nail, they just chopped the legs off along with the wood and threw it in the ossuary. And so now we have this very, very old, the wood, of course, has rotted away, and there's just a piece of bone left. And this is the original image in the article of Biblical Archaeology Review, showing the actual original artifact. The pictures I just showed you a moment ago were replicas, but this is the original. There you can see the nail head. There's the bones of the ankle and feet. There's the nail going through. There's the curved end. And, of course, this is dated to about AD 25 to 42. The name of the person in English is John on the bone box.
Oh,
and they came to the place of the skull. There they crucified him. So
there's three things there. First of all, crucifixions were happening at that time. Secondly, they did involve nails, as the gospel accounts and Psalm 22 describe it. And even more importantly, they gave crucifixion victims the right to a burial.
Yeah, we don't know anything about this guy other than his name was John, and that he was around 27 years old or so, or maybe less, and that he was crucified, and they still gave him a burial. He wasn't tossed in a garbage heap of burning fire.
Which skeptics like to claim, well, Jesus wouldn't have been buried because Romans naturally wouldn't give criminals and political enemies the right to a fair burial. So Jesus, obviously, his body was torn apart by dogs or wild animals. Maybe they lit him on fire or something, but he wasn't buried, so this gospel account can't be trusted. Well, guess what? Solid evidence versus your theory. Which one do you want?
And that's just a few of the examples of how over and over again the New Testament authors, specifically Luke, in his accounts of his investigation as a, well, I guess he was a doctor, and of how accurate he was.
Yeah, and of course, given credit by today's standards. So, once again, just to recap, when we're talking about archaeology, it needs to stem from a fair criteria. If we're asking for people, places, and things, we can talk about the textual evidence as well, early evidence, multiple attestation, hostile testimony, all that other fun stuff. But the simplest way to handle archaeology, the simplest way to be consistent with your evidence, is that the solid always gives more heft, more weight than the imaginary. The real trumps the unreal. So if these things give us more reason to trust what we can know, then just like the illustration I gave with someone walking on stones across the pond, it gets them to the other side, not because every part of the water is solid, but the parts that we can verify get you to where you need to go. And if where we need to go is reason to trust the Bible, most historians would accept one or two things and consider the whole thing valid. I mean, you look at some of the other, like the first historian, for example, Herodotus, the ways he got his information, quite frankly, are absurd. He said that this one guy at one time had a vision or a thought, and this person was huffing volcanic ash and then made this grand declaration. We don't throw out his accounts because he was probably high on something. We accept the fact that he wrote down something, which we're grateful for, but when he makes a claim, for example, the Peloponnesian War, what do? Well, we go to places like Thermopylae and Salamis. We go to, for example, the Persian Empire and ask if there's any record of excursions into Greece. When we and by the way, the Peloponnesian War and the Greek invasions and stuff are two different things. These are just stuff that Herodotus wrote about. If he mentions nations like these, we go to the areas he was talking about and ask for verification. And this is the point. If I have more reasons to trust this than not, then I have established something that all relationships are based on. And this is your exhortation for the day. Proven character. Because when someone violates their character, or rather disrupts their reasons for you to trust them, they get caught in a lie, for example, you have to regain that trust. And if you don't know somebody, you obviously don't want to believe them at their word unless what they're saying is happening all around you. You want reasons to trust them before you are considered reasonable in agreeing with them. And this is the whole point, just like what we're saying here. If we can put our money where our mouth is, in some cases literally, like the point that mentions Caesar Augustus, for example, it all stands or falls on whether or not we can trust the eyewitnesses of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection to have the kind of character not to lie to us, as opposed to the later gospel accounts. If we have more reasons to trust them, and only one reason, which is the assumptions we bring with us, not to trust them, then I have to ask, what will ultimately outweigh the reasons I'm bringing with me not to trust them? They could be emotional, they could be social, they never have been, but they could be intellectual. It ultimately stems from, okay, they got these facts right. I can verify that. What then do I do with that information? Do I say, well, those facts are right, but those facts are still wrong? It's not going to make any difference to them because they've already decided what they're concluding. It has nothing to do with evidence because they don't even know what the word means, which once again, we'll repeat so that it's clear, evidence isn't something that leads you to conclusive proof. It's something that would make something else more likely to be true. People, places, and things are the sort of things we look for. We have writings of names. We have examples of people being treated the way that Jesus was also treated. We have the conditions meeting the time frames. We have individuals who have not only had great influence, but minute influence. We'll get to that more in a minute. Regarding the world at large, and all stemming from this man who at this time in history not only claimed to be God, but proved it in a moment of history. How do you know that? Because the people who were there wrote it down, and they also wrote other things down that I can verify. So I have more reason to trust what I can know and also more reason to trust what I can't know. Not because of my assumptions, but because of their established character. If my assumptions, if my beliefs are ultimately interfering with the evidence, guess who's unobjective? And normally the skeptic would shame this sort of attitude. If you were shown evidence, for example, not conclusive, once again, for things like abiogenesis macroevolution, they provide an example of a transitional form from one species to another, be the first time, by the way, then you could, as a Christian, say, well, I'm going to have to adjust my views of Genesis, specifically the first 11 chapters, but it doesn't change whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. I'm sure the skeptic, if he was nice, then could give you the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, well, I'm glad you at least you're objective. But if on the other hand I were to go the fundamentalist route and say, well, I don't like what that would mean. I don't like what that implies. I'm going to reject this evidence because I already like the evidence that I have over here. They're going to call you irrational and bigoted and homophobic and whatever else they can pull out of their hat that given day. It's ultimately or maybe a Zionist too now, but the point of emphasis always needs to stem or fall on, am I being consistent? And if I don't just show you one piece of evidence, not just two pieces of evidence, but dozens of pieces of evidence for the credibility of the historical accounts of the New Testament, then why don't they take it as history? And the answer is because intellect, evidence, has nothing to do with it. It's just a 3-syllable word they like to throw around because it makes them sound intellectual. The point of emphasis that needs to be is that this is a spiritual obstacle, not an intellectual one. When people give their lives to Jesus, Sir William Ramsay, I'm sure, was a unique case, but that's why I gave him the leeway of saying emotions probably had something to do with it as well. God was working on his heart, as we say. But the point of emphasis, obviously, is no one's going to come to an intellectual understanding of who God is and form a relationship any more than the common modern trope of the, hyper-vigilant intellectual person is going to engage in a marriage for purely academic reasons. This is a relationship we're talking about here. So to summarize and bring all of this back to the main point, the reason we want reasons, if you can follow that, for the New Testament to be true is that's where we get the foundation of our relationship with God from. Like we talked about last week, apart from the resurrection, all of this is meaningless. Because of the resurrection, it means literally everything. But with that then in mind, what reasons do I have to trust the resurrection since I wasn't there? And the reason I have to trust it isn't just that it was reliably transmitted, as we've talked about before, but what was transmitted meets the facts we would hold to any other document in ancient history. So to finish off with this point, and we'll give one more piece of archaeology here as we're signing off, when it comes to the individuals who saw Jesus dead, or literally killed, by the most brutal methods ever known to mankind, the life he had lived up to that point was already exceptional enough, and everyone believed in him, right? Wrong. In fact, members of Jesus' own family, his biological half-brother, the firstborn of Mary and Joseph's natural marriage, were what? Convinced that he was insane, convinced that he was a fraud, convinced and were openly mocking him, saying, well, you're going to do all these things in secret. Don't you want to be famous? Why don't you get on, YouTube instead of just hiding out in those corners and rumble? Don't you want to make yourself known? They literally described him, according to the gospel accounts, as beside himself. And, of course, we also have traditions, not biblical per se, but people who talked about James, the son of Mary and Joseph, the biological half-brother of Jesus, as someone who was a leader of the early church. And when talking about the evidence of the resurrection, he's a vital, hostile witness. But noting that we could make a historical case for the resurrection on his name alone, what reason do we have to believe there even was a James? Maybe the disciples got lucky and made up this historical figure, anticipating what Napoleon Bonaparte would invent post-Renaissance. Obviously, that requires a lot of faith, more than I do. But do we have reason to believe not only that a guy named James existed, but a particular kind of James who serves as an equally vital witness of the resurrection on par with the Apostle Paul?
Well, I don't know if we could provide conclusive evidence in that way.
No such thing. But do we have reason to believe that there was a James, and was he attributed the kind of relation to Jesus that would give us reason to believe he was real?
I know, other than the authors of the New Testament, is there any archaeological evidence? Well, there was a bone box found that's a little bit controversial, and I'll put it up on the screen. I think this is the one that Sean's referring to. It was a bone box, and this is again, Biblical Archaeology Review in 2002. And the inscription on this bone box was really interesting. The inscription says, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Now, for a time, they thought this was fake, but then they did some testing on the actual inscription, and it appears to be very ancient.
It wasn't scribbled in later.
Yeah, it wasn't scribbled in later. The handwriting style matches the writing at the time, which still could have been faked. But then they actually started doing metallurgical studies on the writing. And what people thought was, the claim was, is that maybe it does say James, son of Joseph, but the brother of Jesus part was added later. Well, they have confirmed that this actually was a single inscription. It wasn't something that was added later. They were able to do these like metallurgic tests to see that the tools that were used are consistent with first century tools, and that it's consistent throughout the entire inscription. And so now, is this necessarily, without a shadow of a doubt, the bone box of James?
There's no proof for anything on that absolute level, but we have more reason to believe a figure like James existed when no other family tomb would mention someone's brother.
Yeah, and it's uncommon to do that, to name someone's brother. And Joseph and James are common names, but when you put all three together, it does narrow it down to a lot less. So if it just said son of Joseph, okay, well, there's a lot of sons of Joseph. Tons and tons. But no, James, son of Joseph. So that's still a huge group of people, both very common names. Very, Sean, son of Scott. I'm sure there are a lot of Sean's, sons of Scott.
Check Facebook.
In the United States.
But as the evidence is narrowing down the search, what also expands at the same time? The amount of tangible evidence you'd need to the contrary. And if we have solid evidence, that trumps the imaginary.
You also have paintings of James's bone box being traveled around, dating to hundreds of years later, but still the fact that people believe the bone box was real even over 1,000 years ago is pretty remarkable.
Which would be subjective, but we actually have the thing, so that's cool.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. Very, very exciting. Well, hey, thanks for tuning in. We'll resume back to our normal questions and answers tomorrow. We'll see you then. God bless you.
You've been listening to A Reason for Hope. Thank you again for joining us as we continue our journey through God's Word, one question of the heart at a time. Until we meet again, we would love to connect with you. You can text or email your questions to questionsforhope@gmail.com. You can also find out more about our ministry at calvarychristianfellowship.com. And be sure to join us next time on A Reason for Hope. A Reason for Hope is an outreach ministry of Calvary Christian Fellowship in Tucson, Arizona.